This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
skepticize everything.
Welcome, everybody. This is episode 93 of the Naked Mormonism podcast. Today is Thursday, March 8th, 2018. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. It's been a bit of a struggle deciding what to do for this week's show. Our regular episodes are typically a main history segment with a follow-up interview that's related to the subject matter of the history segment. However, this week is a bit different for a few crucial reasons. Let me give you the background. Every first Monday of the month, we do our NAMO home evenings, and these are Google Hangouts, which are reserved for the listeners who support the show over at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. But this month's Hangout was simply too important and timely to not air on the regular feed. What you're about to hear is a conversation with Sam Young, the figurehead of the Protect LDS Children campaign, who is currently organizing a march on the church office building set to launch on March 30th, 2018. We discuss the campaign in detail, and Sam fields a number of important questions from yours truly and from those who joined in on the call. It's over an hour and a half, and I've also decided to strategically break it up by peppering in a few of the stories that people have sent in through the protectldschildren.org campaign, which makes this entire episode well over 2 hours. It's a long one, but trust me, it's well worth the listen. If you've personally been affected by invasive bishops' interviews, I encourage you to go to the campaign website and write in your story. Many of them are completely anonymous, which is the writer's prerogative. Any Utah listeners out there hearing this prior to March 30th, 2018, I hope you'll seriously consider joining us at noon that day in front of the church office building in Salt Lake City to march for this crucially important cause. You'll find links in the show notes to Sam's other podcast interviews and his media appearances, where you can gain a full grasp of the scope and desires of the campaign. Before getting into the interview, I'm issuing a blanket trigger warning. Some of the issues discussed in the interview are of a sexual nature. And beyond that, some of the stories posted on the Protect LDS Children website discuss some very explicit sexual matters, as well as suicide and suicide attempts. This episode may be hard for some of you to get through. And if you feel that you might be triggered by any of those subjects, you may want to skip some of the stories that are peppered into the episode, or even the entire episode as a whole. I'll voice specific trigger warnings for stories when the story is particularly painful, but these stories matter, and they need to be on the record. At the end of the interview, I'll voice some additional concluding thoughts. You have been warned. Without further ado, here's Sam Young. We are starting our March NAMO home evening. This is our first Monday of the month get-together, where we have featured guests from all over the belief spectrum, all over the world, to talk about something particularly related to Mormonism, if possible. And our special guest this month is Sam Young of the Protect LDS Children campaign, and he's going to tell us all about it and field some questions from the listeners and people who have joined us, as well as from myself, and I'm really looking forward to getting into this. So Sam, welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Well, it's a delight to be with a bunch of naked Mormons. I can't rest. I'm sorry about that.
Well, I told you that I podcast for a living, and I found that you don't need pants to podcast. It's really wonderful. So what we were talking about before, we hit the record button, I asked you where your screen name comes from, this 2-qubit Invisibles qubit. Tell us how this came about. How did you come to run into a Invisible qubit's name here?
So the Apostle Paul in the New Testament gives a name for God that really resonated with me. That as I was going through a faith transition and I'm looking at all kinds of things, I came across this statement by Paul. He says, we worship the invisible God. And I thought, invisible, I can relate to that. I've never seen God. I don't know anybody that's seen God. So Paul calling him the invisible God, super. That's a new name of God for me. So invisible in the Invisibles qubit name is God. So it's Invisibles qubit, God's something. Okay, qubit. You probably don't know this, Bryce, but there are some problems in the translation of the Book of Abraham.
Is there?
But there's some really interesting stuff about it. In the facsimiles, I think it's facsimile 2, the facsimiles Joseph Smith translated. We have the actual facsimiles that he translated. And in a certain area of the facsimile of the image, Joseph Smith said, this is what this particular character means in Egyptian. It means that on Kolob, a cubit equals a day. How cool is that? Who knew that? When do you ever get that quoted at sacrament meeting? That guess what? We've been revealed some really great information. On Kolob, a day equals a cubit. So Invisibles qubit would be God's day. That's the name of my blog, God's Day. So there you go.
Wow, that's some. I like to try and put the deepness of Mormon doctrine onto some kind of gradation or some kind of scale. That's like center of the earth deep Mormon doctrine that you pulled that from. That's pretty impressive. My kudos to you, Sam. Well done. So
we could stop this interview right now. You've already gotten to the center of Mormonism.
There it is. It's Invisibles qubit. It's God's Day. So, okay, Sam, you've been blogging under Invisibles qubit. I have seen you posting up on the ex-Mormon subreddit. Or cross posts from you on the ex-Mormon subreddit. I have seen your online presence all over. This has only been a recent advent of your life, it seems. I mean, how long have you been blogging and talking about Mormonism and your belief in Mormonism, and has that all been connected to the campaign?
Well, I started blogging in May of 2016, so coming up on 2 years. Blogging about the topic that is in that I'm really working on today started a year ago, started in March of last year. Blogging about bishops' interviews with children.
Okay. And how did, so the Protect LDS Children campaign is much more recent than that. I mean, it took it took over a year before the petition actually went up. Walk us through the evolution of what happened that you started this blog back in May of 2016. How did it evolve into what it is today to where you're taking the fight to the doorsteps of the church office building? Walk us through. There's a lot that I feel like I'm missing here.
Okay, well, the blog is kind of my evolution. My faith journey was pretty complete by that point, but I still hadn't decided where I was going to land. But I started blogging that journey, and I was running into issues that were what I looked at and said, look, this is just dead wrong in our church. We need to change this. And so I'd write about it. I wrote a lot about common consent. The beautiful part of our church was that Jesus Christ empowered all of us when we were baptized with a vote, that we had a voice that could be exercised with common consent. Now today that doesn't work very well. That's been way watered down from what I believe it is. I mean, you're studying the Doctrine and Covenants. It's several places in the Doctrine and Covenants. It doesn't even, nowhere in the Doctrine and Covenants does it say you can't drink iced tea and go to heaven and not go to heaven.
Right.
But it talks about common consent all over the place. It never mentions coffee. It mentions hot drinks once, but it mentions common consent in many places. Anyway, so I blogged a lot about common consent, and I started exercising common consent at every single voting conference, which we have 4 of those every year. It wasn't until last March when I about 2 years ago, the issue of bishops' interviews came to mind. I became aware that was a problem. We were talking to kids about masturbation. That's all I'd heard, but I hadn't heard much about it. So I talked to my stake president and bishop for the first time about 2 years ago, that I didn't think we should be doing that. But it wasn't for another year that my mind really got engaged in it.
So,
question?
Let's walk back a second, though. I mean, you were a bishop for 5 years, if I'm not mistaken. Did you not ever engage in any of this questioning yourself?
Well, you're mistaken. I've never been a bishop.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I'm just kidding, Bryce. I served as a bishop for 5 years. Yeah.
I was like, okay, so then everything that I've read about you, every single report has been wrong? What just happened? You in one sentence, you gaslighted my entire existence. Well done, Sam. Applause to you, good sir. Okay, you're a bishop for 5 years. Let's get that fact out. That's not fake news. Let's get that out on the table.
Okay, so when I grew up, I was never asked by any bishop any sexual questions. I was never asked, do you masturbate?
Really?
I asked, do I live the law of chastity? But I don't remember that. Anyway, so I had innocuous interviews as a kid. They were just, the first time I was asked about masturbation was only once, and it happened once on my mission. Now, you have regular, over the course of 2 years, you have regular interviews. I don't remember a single one, except that one. And I was 21 years old at that point. And I remember that. It makes an impression on our children when they're asked that. Well, at 21, I was kind of an adult, but I remember that. Now, I became a bishop when I was 39 years old. The thought never crossed my mind to ask a 12-year-old girl sitting in front of me, oh, by the way, hey, do you touch yourself between your legs? Why would I ever ask that question? So it wasn't part of my heritage. It wasn't part of my experience. I was never taught that as a bishop, that I should ask any of those questions. So I just never did. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, actually, I find this interesting because, I grew up in the Utah church, and I know that you didn't necessarily grow up in the Utah church.
I did. I grew up in Layton, Utah.
In Layton, Utah. Okay, I was mistaken in that aspect as well. Are you gaslighting me again? Is that what this is?
No, I grew up in Layton, Utah.
Okay. But I remember being asked those questions multiple times as a kid, both from my parents and from the bishop. And it always felt like a unified front that was working against my own sexual tendencies as a teenager and a kid growing up, that I had to keep up this constant facade. No, I'm not touching myself, I promise. And I don't know if that's necessarily a healthy way for kids to grow up. And I think that's one of the main contentions that you kind of deal with. Story number 276, name hidden. The first time I ever masturbated was on my mission at age 21. I knew I had to confess to my mission president, but I sat there in silence for what seemed like a few minutes, unable to speak. Finally, I blurted it out. My mission president responded with, "Do you think that is why you are not baptizing?" We were teaching more lessons than just about any mission companionship, activating several families in a newly split area, and that was the response I got? A guilt trip? Stop asking inappropriate questions and using shame and guilt. In all of your time, before we actually get to the subject of what the campaign is and what you hope to accomplish, in your time working with this campaign and being plugged into this community, have you seen that it seems like it's more prevalent that these explicit questions are asked? Or does it seem like those are just exceptions, but by and large, most bishops' interviews don't go that way.
Well, I don't have enough data and have not done a scientific study to really comment authoritatively on that. However, in the last 6 months, I've had 3 opportunities to be with 40 to 60 people in a gathering, active and inactive and ex-Mormons. So all of them growing up having grown up in the church, so they had had the experience of being interviewed while they're youth. And I posed 2 questions to them. One, were you asked about masturbation as a kid? It's one group was about 75% that raised their hands and said yes. One group was about 50% that said yes. And one group was about 90% that said yes.
Wow.
So I would say somewhere between 50 and 75% were probably asked. I've asked 3 of my children, and one of them was asked. And that's part of the story that I'll probably tell you, we'll get into in a second. The other 2 were not asked as youth. I was their bishop during the youth period, but they were asked very explicit questions when they went to BYU at their first interview. Let's see. I think I lost track of what your question was there, Bryce.
Well, no, I think you've definitely answered it. It seems like obviously there's a selection bias with the groups that you've been meeting with since starting the campaign. That
yeah, that's right.
I mean, by and large, the people that are coming to meet with you at these get-togethers are people who have been personally affected by this or who have loved ones who've been affected by this. But I think that does speak to the nature that this is obviously a problem that's quite pervasive, that's worth discussing and worth talking about. And so now you've started the Protect LDS Children campaign. For someone who has never heard of this, or someone who may be listening to this in the backlogs, months or years after this story has blown up and gone away, and some other big story is talked about, tell us exactly what this campaign, this Protect LDS Children campaign, is, and what you hope to accomplish with it.
Okay, so in the church, it's a common practice. We're not sure how common it is. It's a common practice, though, for bishops. Actually, it's not a common practice for bishops to take children behind closed doors all alone for an interview. That is ubiquitous in our society. That's a part of the policies of the church to do that. And it's common for those children all alone behind closed doors to be probed with sexual questions. Do you masturbate? That is a very explicit sexual question. It is to you and me if someone out of the blue is going to ask us that. But to a child, to a 7-year-old child, what the heck are we doing that for? To a 12-year-old, to a 13, many of those at that age are not going to know what it means. Anyway, so we're asking explicit questions. And the questions can go way beyond that. If a child says yes, they do masturbate, then it can get even more explicit. Well, do you do it under or over your panties? What the hell? How many fingers do you use? Do you reach a climax? Where do you do it? How many times do you do it? Or if in the process of discussing the law of chastity, some poor soul makes a confession, it's also a common thing for that bishop to start asking very graphic and explicit sexual questions. What were the sexual positions you engaged in? Did your boyfriend reach an orgasm? Where the hell did he reach an orgasm? Was it anal? Was it oral? Okay, so we have in our church, we're taking children behind closed doors all alone and asking them, and the bishop has the ability, has the go-ahead to ask them whatever questions come into their mind. The church calls it whatever the Spirit guides the bishop to ask is okay. So the movement This is a very troubling practice. It's our society outside of the church has already moved well beyond this, recognizing it's a dangerous and damaging thing to our children. And so the petition, the movement is calling for that to stop, that we stop one-on-one interviews and we stop asking sexually explicit questions.
Okay, so I want to dig into the details. These are the 2 points that your entire campaign hinges on, is stopping one-on-one interviews and stopping sexually explicit questioning in these interviews, right?
Correct.
The argument can be made, and I'm hoping that you've been posed with this counter argument before, but and have a canned answer ready for it. But the argument can be made that kids who may not admit to another adult something that's going on in their household that needs to be talked about may feel more comfortable in a one-on-one setting talking to their bishop. Let's use an explicit example. Let's say that a child is being sexually abused in their home. They may feel the ability to open up to a single one-on-one adult, their bishop, whereas if there are two or three adults in the room, whether it's their parents or not, they may not feel the ability to open up about that. Is that a criticism that you think holds any water, that maybe we should keep one-on-one interviews going because that creates an intimate setting where these kids can open up? Or do you think that there's any way to kind of circumvent that?
Okay. First of all, that is a very valid question, concern. There are a number of different scenarios. The first scenario is just the regular interviews. The kids go through these worthiness interviews at least twice a year. It could be 3 or 4 times a year, depending on whether or not they are having a temple trip and they have to get a temple recommend. Now, those are where the bishop pulls them in and goes through the worthiness questions. The child didn't voluntarily raise their hand and said, look, I'd like to come in and confess something, or I'd like to come in and discuss something. So that covers probably 90% of the interviews where we're saying, no, they should not be one-on-one. Either the parent should be there or a trusted adult chosen by the child. Okay, now let's address the issue you've got right there. What about child abuse? That is a legitimate question. But there's another issue with the bishops talking about sexual matters. They are not trained on how to deal with this. They don't know the risks. They don't know how the child can be damaged. They don't know the child's sexual development and how that can be all stunted. And they don't understand the concepts of shame that can last for decades with that child. So first of all, we're dealing with an untrained man. Now let's take a look at that person's being sexually abused at home. Well, there's no way that it's appropriate for them to bring their parent with them. But it would make sense for them to have a safe place where they could go talk to the bishop about something that is happening. Again, it should be with another trusted adult, whether that be their young women's president or young men's president or whoever they feel comfortable with. Maybe it's another counselor in the bishopric. The one-on-one situations, we have a hang-up. We have been normalized to that as a culture, that one-on-one, you don't feel comfortable talking about being sexually abused. Well, you know what? We should feel comfortable, or we should feel very uncomfortable for that child coming in to talk one-on-one, because that the child, if they're already being sexually abused, they're now going to be groomed additionally that it's okay to sit down with any man of authority that's dressed nice, that appears good. So reinforcing whatever grooming they have already gone through for their abusers. And the bishop doesn't know how to handle that situation anyway. Once you find out there's abuse involved, then that should go directly to a professional, not sit there and discuss all the details of the abuse. And so having somebody else in that room should facilitate that child feeling more protected by having an advocate for them in that room. So there's a number of problems in discussing sex. And are you familiar with the stories that we've been collecting from folks that have had very bad consequences.
I was hoping we could dive into that a little bit at some point. And we're welcome.
Well, I just want to say about a third of them are children that were abused. They went to their bishops, and the way they were treated, they had, many of them will say the damage that was done by the bishop was worse than the damage done by the sexual abuser, which is just stunning to hear that, because the bishops are not trained on how to deal with that.
Story number 127, name hidden. I have a child currently attending at BYU, Idaho. The bishop there has asked several students how often they plan to have sex after marriage, including our child. The bishop then proceeds to explain that it isn't as often as the student thinks because of things like pregnancy and menstrual cycles. We know of at least 3 students this has happened to, young men and young women. This is a sitting bishop. It has caused a huge amount of pain and frustration and even questioning of our faith in our very active LDS home. I fail to see how a 50-year-old man asking a 19-year-old girl how often she plans to have sex once she's married and the giving of advice on the effect of menstruation on that frequency has any place in our church or ecclesiastical leadership. So tell us, in these, and obviously the information, the stories that you're collecting, much of it is anonymous, and these are all anecdotal stories. But having this plethora of anecdotes definitely shows us that there are some data points that we should maybe collect or at least look at to see if there is enough data on this to make actionable decisions based on. Based on just what you've seen out of these, what does that look like when the bishop, the meeting with the bishop has done more damage than what has happened to the person before they met with the bishop? What does that look like?
Okay, well, first of all, let me just say something about the bishops. The vast majority of bishops are good men without training. They're the accountant down the street that knows accounting. They're the dentist that knows dentistry, but they have had no training in counseling children, in therapy, in the dangers that surround talking about sex with kids. So they have no training on that, but they're good men. I think most of the damage that is happening is inadvertent. Now, we do have pedophiles that are bishops. We've got stories on the webpage where the child was sexually abused by the bishop. So we put the children in a situation where we have the perfect. We're the only institutional church in America that allows one-on-one interviews, and certainly one-on-one interviews where sex is going to be discussed. The only one.
Actually, Sam, I've heard you say that a few times. I unfortunately have to dispel that claim because Jehovah's Witnesses do the same thing.
Okay.
Jehovah's Witnesses definitely do the same thing. And it could be...
No, they don't. The Jehovah's Witnesses have 2. They don't keep the child behind closed doors. They have 2 or 3 men in that room. Okay. So it's not a one-on-one.
Okay.
It may have been a long time, but it's not today.
What would you draw an equivocation between Catholic confessionals with a single reverend and these bishops' interviews?
That's not behind a closed door. There was a time that behind closed doors was acceptable after all the problems the Catholic Church had over the behind the closed doors deal. They don't do that anymore. So they'll have a confessional, but that is out in the open. Interesting.
I'll have to look into that deeper because I've heard you say that a couple of times, and every time it's raised my flag of skepticism. Like, is that true? There must be some other congregation out there. But I think the point that you're getting at is this is the only institution where that is a systematic practice, where from the top down, that is how the entire community operates, is through these one-on-one behind closed door interviews, which that's obviously creates a system ripe for abuse. And I think that's kind of the central point. It's like, there's abuse happening. We need to do something about this abuse, right? Story number 294, name hidden. 20-ish years ago, in the 7th grade, I had a history teacher. He was single, in his late 30s, and he was very interested in having kids come swim at his house, the ones who got good grades. He had several hush-hush parties of which he did not have permission from the school administration. Just he and a couple of students, to reward the ones who maybe got an A or ones who showed big progress. What a nice guy, and how fair, I thought. He was going above and beyond his job to give rewards to students. I thought he'd make such a good Mormon. Mormons are just like that, so kind, so generous. Surely, he should take the discussions. I could see how improved his life would be. Maybe he could meet a young Mormon woman and get married in the temple. I saw absolutely nothing wrong. No red flags at all, because I was used to being alone with an older man, a nice, caring, middle-aged man who asked deeply personal questions one-on-one with me a couple of times per year. This was very normal to me. How protected I felt, knowing I could talk one-on-one with not only my teachers, but my bishop, who was called of God, and his counselors as well. The world felt so safe, and Heavenly Father had blessed me in every possible way, was my thought. A plot twist occurred here, though. It was soon discovered that my bishop was having an affair with a ward member. The one who was a judge over me, who could question my chastity and worthiness, was the one committing adultery, and had been for an entire year. I thought he was so righteous, a true man of God and infallible. He was a bishop. How could this happen? This was a reality check for me, as I had suddenly recognized the very human tendencies of even righteous priesthood holders, even the most elect. The ones I am supposed to follow and to whom I should confess and discuss personal sins. A few years later, the history teacher was arrested for several accounts of sexual abuse of minors. I'm so fortunate that the abuse did not happen to me, but it terrifies me to think how close I came to subjecting myself to this because I saw no danger in the situation. I was perfectly willing to put myself in a completely abusive situation because of my own Mormon culture. There was actual danger all around me, and I could not see or discern the danger. Where the rest of the world insists now that children and minors are never alone one-on-one with an adult, whether they be a professional teacher, coach, or physician, our church lags behind. And I believe all efforts should be made to stop one-on-one situations from occurring between minors and adults.
So let me go back to my statement about we're the only ones, the only institutional, actually, it's the only reputable institutional church in America that does this. That comes from SNAP, the Survivors Network of Abuse, Survivors Network of those abused by priests. Yeah. They were very instrumental in bringing out, revealing that the Catholics had this major problem in the Catholic Church. The priests had this major problem. And so when they heard about this movement, they wrote an article, and that was right off the bat. They were saying that. I gave her a call, the author. I said, look, I just want to make sure this is true. What about the Jehovah's Witnesses? She said, oh, no, Jehovah's Witnesses don't do this. Here's what they do. What about the Catholics? Oh, no, they got rid of this. Here's what they do. And the other one I asked him about was judges. And her comment was, I say that all reputable institutional churches, they are not reputable. So they may or may not, she didn't have a lot of information about them. And then I asked them, well, what about Big Brother? You're saying not only churches, but all clubs. And she went through, well, here's what they do. And so, yes, they are going to be alone at some points in time. They've got very specific rules. They've got gigantic training. They've got background checks. Our church has nothing, none of that stuff. We don't have any training. We don't have any background checks. And we institutionalized behind the closed door. So it's them that said that. Now, there could be, so I asked her, so are you familiar with every single little church that pops up? She says, no. I'm talking about institutional churches, like the Baptists, like the Presbyterians, like the Jehovah's Witness. Mormons were the only ones to do that.
Story number 371, Name Hidden. When I was a very naive 12-year-old, I attended my first bishop's interview. I was scared and really had no idea what to expect. I was intimidated by anyone in a leadership position. I think it all started out fine, and then I was hit with a question that I never imagined being asked. Are you and blank, my best friend at the time, lesbians? To be honest, I had no idea what a lesbian was. So I said I didn't think so and asked what it was. He continued to ask me if her and I were inappropriately touching each other. I was mortified. I was as naive as they come and had never once even had that thought cross my mind. I was your typical silly 12-year-old girl. We lived where there weren't a ton of Mormons around, so when we would all get together for activities and see each other at church, it was so much fun. We all had a special bond. Well, he continued to ask me if I masturbated. Again, not a clue what that was. So he continued to teach me about masturbation, including how horrible it is. I had never been more embarrassed and ashamed in my life. I hadn't even done what he was asking, yet still felt like I should feel guilty. I wanted to share because this conversation has stuck with me for years. I constantly was worried that my innocent friendships with girls were not really considered innocent, or that I was doing something wrong by merely having a best friend. I was so self-conscious. Did I giggle too much? Did we hang out too much? What was I doing to make people think this? Did everyone see something I didn't? I'm so emotional writing this because it took such a toll on my innocence. I now have 2 daughters, and the thought of them going through what I did makes me sick. My children will never be alone in a room with a man of authority over them, no matter how much I trust him. I know there are so many stories far more damaging than mine. To my 12-year-old self, however, it was horrific. It changed me. Along this same vein, I want to kind of ask about how this has been received, because this is obviously a very complex issue. And one thing that the LDS Church runs into when it comes to bishops having training and people in the bishopric having the training to be able to counsel people, to be, sex abuse counselors and people who are actually qualified to give people life advice relating to sexuality or anything in general, is that they are, as you said, dentists, they're business professionals, they have day jobs, they have families, and then they're called to the bishopric and they're expected to do everything that is incumbent on leading a parish in addition to their entire professional life. And that's because LDS has lay clergy. However, it seems if you were to create a system where bishops get enough training, that would require enough training to become a qualified counselor before they become a bishop, which would require that they would have to be paid to be in the bishopric, or at least have a living stipend like the general authorities do. What would you say to that? Would you be okay with bishops, taking a living stipend from the church in order to get the training necessary to become a registered counselor and a mandatory reporter, and in order to put all of these professional stop losses into place? How do you feel about that, Sam?
I think every single bishop should start a podcast like Naked Mormonism, because you can make a living doing that at the same time being bishop. The change that we're looking for is not a change in doctrine. It's not a change in theology. It's not a change in lay clergy. There are some benefits to lay clergy, but one of the benefits, or the benefits do not include that we have an expert at the head of the congregation that knows how to counsel for marriages and certainly doesn't know how to dispense proper counsel to a sex abuse victim or to talk to anybody about sexual development. They simply do not have that level of training. So how would I feel about the bishops getting enough training? Or was the question getting training or becoming paid clergy?
Well, I guess it would have to, those two are kind of inextricably tied, because getting enough training to actually be qualified to do what a bishop does, that would be a full-time job. So
yeah. And that's what I think too. That is a huge stretch. That's a huge change that would have to be made in the church.
Story number 80, name hidden. Trigger warning, this story includes sexual abuse. I wish I could share the details, but the victims don't want to go public. A man I loved and trusted as much as my own dad was a bishop while he was molesting his own children. There is no question about this. He admitted to it when he was confronted. Who knows how many other children he abused behind closed doors. If you think a bishop has some kind of special angel trust power, think again. Don't trust anybody at church with your kids. behind closed doors.
We can make this change easy. It's so easy to say, okay, we want parents in the interview or another trusted adult. And you don't talk about sex. Turn those things over to the family. When I found out my child had been asked for 6 years behind closed doors, behind my back, if she masturbated, you know what? I was not happy about that. If I'd known that, if I had to do it over again, I'd say, look, I am responsible for the development of my children in all areas, including the sexual development. I'm not turning that over to some person that's a really nice guy and is my friend, but he doesn't know what the heck's going on. And I don't want shame to be attached to sex with my children. So I would want to take that over. Anyway, the changes are relatively simple. You're asking another step that's really outside of the purview of what we're after.
Absolutely. And it does kind of require a little bit of speculation on your part on whether or not that would be the right way to go about this or not. Sam, I don't know if you're keeping an eye on the comments section, but there's basically a separate conversation going on everything that we say, and it's a lot of fun over there.
No, so where would I see that?
There's a little comments icon where you and I were chatting before we hit the record button. You can click that little chat bubble and you should be able to read back on the previous comments there.
Okay.
But that's a totally separate point. I wanted to ask, when it comes to putting pressure on the church from the outside, and that's, not working our way up in, as a member into an office of, any authority to try and create systematic changes, but being a believing member or being ex-members like some of us are here in this group, or being, somebody who's never connected with Mormons, putting pressure on the church, social pressure, is often met with opposition from the church itself. And I can see how your campaign may be met with opposition because it's the status quo. And it may be just pure tradition that this is how we're doing things now. This is how we're going to keep doing things because it's successful the way that we're doing it. Obviously, we all see problems with that. But I see this opposition, this possible opposition coming down the pike. And I'm wondering how you're willing to compromise if the church is unwilling to meet the two very seemingly simple demands of this Protect LDS Children campaign. Where do you think a compromise could come into play?
Well, I'm not compromising. So the church is going to make the changes, period. There's no way in our society that they're going to be able to continue to take children behind closed doors all alone and talk about sex. I challenge anybody to go to their neighbor that's not a member of the church and ask them what they think about, how would they feel if their pastor took their 12-year-old daughter all alone behind closed doors and asked her if she masturbated. They will all be disgusted by that. So society has already moved past this. So the church has to make these changes. Society, there's huge legal risks that the church is now taking. Before all this stuff was out, people really were not aware of what was going on. Now that we know what's going on, all the damage that has happened because of these interviews, the church is not going to be protected going down the pike. So there's legal implications for our bishops. There's legal implications for the church. There's missionary things. If we were out there and broadcast, hey, if you're looking for the institution in America that takes children behind closed doors and asks if they masturbate, we're it. We're the only ones that do that. You know what? That's going to turn everybody off what we're doing. So I know the church, for a number of reasons, is going to make this change. I don't know how long, but I am pushing for it. I and 16,000 other people are pushing for this now, because if it takes another 5 years to make the change, that's 5 years of more stories of children's childhoods who have been devastated. How many more suicides will happen in the next 5 years? How many more sexual abuse cases are going to happen because of what we're doing? How many kids are going to loathe themselves so much during their childhood that they attempt suicide? I mean, it's every day that goes by, Bryce, we're nudging kids closer to horrid consequences.
Story number 229, Sarah F. Trigger warning, this story includes sexually explicit questioning, slut shaming, and suicide. When I was 17, I slept with my older boyfriend. I told my parents what had happened and they told me it was bad enough I needed to confess to the bishop. I'd never had an issue talking to a bishop before because luckily my mom and I were close enough she told me when it was okay to not confess to something or just say yes or no to get through a childhood interview. So I knew this time would be different. I never did find out if I'd be in trouble because after my confession, instead of hearing comfort and what I needed to do to repent, the questions began. Did he go over or under your clothes? Did he insert fingers? Would you have liked him to use his fingers? Do you ever use your fingers when alone? Ew, no, no, no. Finally, in tears, I told him I was feeling disgusted and to please stop those types of questions. He said, "Do you know why you're crying? Because you've realized you're a slut. Does anyone respect sluts? Will anyone marry a slut?" I got up against his protests and left. But it didn't end there. This bishop has both a daughter and a niece my age who went to my school. I noticed people talking about me and laughing as I passed. My friend came up to me and said, "You really shouldn't tell your bishop things anymore." When I asked why, she told me that his daughter and niece were telling everyone that at an Easter get-together, he had told everyone about what I had said, in confidence, in his office. He didn't keep it quiet like he was supposed to. The bullying over being called a slut and whore at school thanks to this bishop made me feel I could never face these people again, and his words, "Who would marry a slut?" kept repeating over and over and over in my head, all because I came close to going all the way with my boyfriend. But we were smart and stopped before it got to that. I went home and took 20 painkillers, 30 sleeping pills, slit my wrists, and waited in the bathtub. I couldn't go to school, and I was never getting married now. My parents knew and thought I was headed in the wrong direction and kept forcing the idea of more meetings with the bishop on me. I wasn't going back to that man just to watch him gleefully ask for details and hear slut again. When I told our stake president, he said I was a liar, so no one was on my side. I'd just been through what, for an LDS teenager, is one of the worst things ever. Mad parents, told I'm never getting married, a bishop who can't be trusted, a school full of people who kept calling me a slut, and no one to support me. Luckily, my mom found me in time, and the ER doctors were able to get the pills out of my system and the bleeding to stop. And I finished my junior and senior years of high school through BYU's distance learning program, and I was allowed to go inactive until we had a new bishop. But first time I went to church, 3 years later, I had an anxiety attack and had to leave sobbing. I have never been in a bishop's interview since. I chose not to get married in the temple to avoid a worthiness interview. That one bishop changed the whole course of my young adult life.
So that's why I'm pushing for it today. I know they're going to make it, but I'm not willing to stand on the sidelines knowing the damage we're doing to our kids.
This is obviously represented in all the pictures that I've seen of you in your, winter garb with your scarf and the lion sign that says Protect LDS Children out in front of congregations. Like, you are obviously extremely motivated towards this campaign. We are all behind you. We all love this. We support this. This is something that needs to happen. This is something that the church is far antiquated about, that they need to make a change on. I so agree with you. I am right behind you, and I will see you on March 30th in front of the church office building. I will shake your hand.
Great.
However, I said all of that, and there's a big but on it, because, Sam, this is an ideological campaign. There's an ideology behind this, and the church has responded to ideologues with pushback before. We have seen how many times they have excommunicated or disparaged people who have tried to push the church to make a systematic change. The September 6th is just one of the most recent examples where scholars were trying to push the church in a way to be a little bit more open about the church's history. They were ideologues, pushing transparency. Sam, I'm not saying this in any way to disparage the movement or disparage what you say. I'm trying to look at this through a realistic lens. I feel like the church is going to treat you the way they have treated ideologues in the past. And I'm sad to say that. I'm sad to think that that is what's going to happen. But I also want to view this through a very realistic lens. How do you think, if they do not invite you into the church office building on the evening of March 30th and say, okay, what is it you want? What are we going to change? What are you willing to move on? What are you willing to allow in order to get them to move closer towards what we see as the moral objective here?
Well, let's see. Well, let me address first the issue of September 6th, that I might be excommunicated. So here's where I landed in my faith transition. I decided that I was going to no longer operate under blind faith, that I was going to operate under faith as described in the scriptures. The faith described in the Book of Mormon and the Bible is the evidence of things hoped for. It's evidence-based. My faith, I decided a couple years ago that I was going to follow a path based on faith in something I had real evidence for. And what evidence did I have? I had evidence that the teachings and example of Jesus Christ were a good and satisfying, fulfilling way to live my life. So I decided 2 years ago, I am going to follow the teachings and example of Jesus Christ in the Church of Jesus Christ, which is my heritage, which is my church, which is where my family is. And certainly I thought at the time that it's reasonable to follow the teachings and example of Jesus Christ in the Church of Jesus Christ. And I still think that's a total reasonable thing to do. But if you look at the example of Jesus Christ, what the hell happened to Jesus Christ when he spoke out against the church of his time, the very church he founded? Well, let's see. They didn't just excommunicate him. They put him on the cross. They executed Jesus Christ. I don't think I'm going to be executed. I'm pretty sure that cannot happen, but I could be excommunicated. And, that the exemplar that I have, he was willing to stand up and tell the truth, stand up for the least, stand up for those that couldn't stand up and speak for themselves. He was the one that kind of example inspires me. It's actually throughout the scriptures. We got it in the Book of Mormon. What happened to Abinadi when he stood up to the priests of his time? Well, let's see. They did execute him too, in a pretty excruciating manner. Again, that's not going to happen to me, but Jesus Christ is the example I'm following. If I get excommunicated, so we've had communications about this with my family who is active in the church. My oldest daughter, very active in the church, had a conversation with her the other day. I says, honey, I could be now this was a month ago after the stake president told me what he told me, but I told her I could very well be excommunicated over this. And she's begging me to continue to do what I'm doing. Don't stop speaking out, Dad. We need this to change. And I said, I may be excommunicated. She did something like that. Excommunication means nothing. You're following Jesus Christ. I thought, yes. So I'm not I don't want that to happen. I don't think I'd enjoy that very much. Yeah. But I think I would really not enjoy living the rest of my life knowing what is happening to our children behind closed doors. And I sat here eating my ramen noodles at night and not worrying what the hell's happening to our kids.
Story number 184, name hidden. I remember having to decide whether to confess to masturbation at my baptismal interview a few months shy of my 8th birthday. I decided to confess, since it was what God wanted, but chickened out when I was actually sitting in a room alone across a heavy desk from my childhood bully's dad in my white baptism dress. I went through with the baptism without telling anybody about the terrible sin I was carrying around, and promised God in prayer that I would stay clean and never do it again. Although 8-year-olds are champions of self-restraint, I didn't make it 2 weeks. Guilt followed me through the next decade, as I told myself that each interview would be the one where I would finally confess, and then failed as I sat across that desk from a parade of balding strangers. As a Mormon girl, I felt like a profoundly broken person for having this habit, or human need, at all, much less not being able to kick it. Once I started having sex, I physically couldn't do penetration because I would freeze up so badly, a condition called vaginismus. While my partner and I were able to overcome that, I still cry at every gynecological exam. And maybe worst of all, I didn't ever think any of this was wrong until well into adulthood. I'm so glad that somebody within the church has taken this stand, because 1,000 ex-Mormons yelling at the church for, not changing, or that they need to change about this, that's not going to do as much as having one person who is a believing, active member who used to be a bishop coming in to, try and effect change from the inside. I think that has a lot more staying power, and that only goes to show just how needed this campaign really is. And I like that you are open-minded about the possibilities of you being excommunicated from this. As much of a realization and as hard to wrestle with that as that possibility is, I think that it's something that we should definitely keep on our minds, and I'm sure it's weighed heavily on your conscience in, every time you do an interview where you try and publicize more about this. I'm sure that it walks that needle a little bit closer towards excommunication, which is really sad to see that is it seems to be the church's solution when somebody speaks up. But I'm kind of curious about your take on the broader impact of the movement itself when the person is excommunicated. I offer as an example Kate Kelly with Ordained Women and John Dehlin with Mormon Stories. These two are figureheads in the Mormon community who are giving voice to people who have felt grieved by the church or wronged by the church in somehow, who are working as members of the church to try and incite reform in some way. They're both excommunicated, and now the Ordained Women and the Mormon Stories movements are seen by a number of believing members as, they're apostates. We don't talk about what they're doing. We don't listen to Mormon Stories because it's anti-Mormon because he was excommunicated. Do you think that might be a possible outcome for the Protect LDS Children campaign if you get excommunicated?
Well, it could be, but I've got a couple observations on that. Number one, there's been a lot of coverage already in local media, some in national media, a lot of coverage up in Salt Lake City, which has raised awareness. A lot here in Houston that's raised awareness. There will be national media coming out. I think for the church to excommunicate me because I'm trying to protect the kids. Kate was working for something that may be a doctrinal change. Some people could argue that, no, it was doctrine already. Joseph Smith, if you look at some of his teachings, the women were going to get the priesthood. But it's basically a doctrinal change to most people. But this is not a doctrinal change that we're working. We're working to do things that our entire society knows are right. They agree with this movement. To excommunicate, I believe, would really heighten the level of interest in the media, in the church. Really? Oh, yeah. The church just kicked out the guy that is trying to implement things that are totally reasonable. So I think the church would not be well served by doing that. But then the second observation is, knowing that excommunication is a possibility and that it could affect my how the campaign is perceived, how would that change what I'm doing? I still want to protect the kids. So even if it would have an effect afterwards, it doesn't change. I'm not going to stand down because it may affect our campaign 6 months from now. No, I'm going to stand up and I'm going to keep standing up. regardless of whatever. It just doesn't change what is right and wrong in this situation.
That's a really solid takeaway. I agree with you, and I'm glad that you are so deeply motivated about this, because a person who is doing this without the ideological motivations may find the fear of excommunication override their rationale when it comes to moving forward with the campaign. And I'm glad that you have a cool, calculated head about you and say, hey, if that's the cost of this campaign, then so be it. I think that's a smart and realistic way to look at this. And I think that only strengthens the movement more from my perspective. And I hate to say this, but in much the way that ordained women and Mormon stories gained attraction when their figureheads were excommunicated, I almost hope that that is a conversation that's on the table in the church office right now. Because if you are excommunicated, that will be one of the greatest talking points for ex-Mormons and secular Mormons, showing how the church will not move on what seems like the most simple possible thing. And this is like you said, Sam, this is not doctrine. This is policy. There is no doctrine that says, there's no revelation in the Doctrine and Covenants that says bishops must meet with the children at periodic times throughout their life and ask sexually explicit questions. That's nowhere to be found in the church canon anywhere. This is only a policy, and that makes it seem like they should be able to move easier on this. But I also see this that when the church has been forced to move on things in the past, like when it came to the open practice of polygamy in Utah territory, when it came to African Americans having the priesthood, it came down to the church's pocketbooks. When they were threatened monetarily, when the church was disincorporated in 1890, they issued the first manifesto when they wanted to get statehood. When Bob Jones University had their tax-exempt status revoked, that was one of the final nails in the coffin that for segregation, I should say. That was one of the final nails in the coffin for the church to finally give African Americans the priesthood. When their pocketbook is threatened, that's when it seems like they're most motivated to change in convenient times. And I don't see where monetarily this is having an impact unless we try and zoom out and say, well, yeah, hundreds or thousands of people are no longer attending and giving tithing. That doesn't seem to have as direct correlation as like tax exempt status being threatened or something like that. So How do you think that plays into this?
Well, since I'm not in their shoes, I'm not in church headquarters, I have no idea how they make their decisions. The things you said right there about they made decisions based on outside pressure or tax exempt or whatever. Yeah, I get that. I don't know if that's for sure the reason they made those changes, but I would rather look at it this way, that we are campaigning to support the apostles. When you have a cultural tradition, that's not always an easy thing to change. To simply announce, we are not doing polygamy anymore, that didn't work. It took another 20 years before polygamy was gone. So for the apostles, right now I'd say the apostles are thinking about this. They know they need to do this, but they don't know quite how to do it without disrupting a whole bunch of stuff. We're going to march up there in support of the changes that are on the table. We are supporting them in making, finally making this change now rather than waiting 10 years to make it. So I guess there's two ways to look at it.
Fair enough. When you were a bishop,
and let me mention something else you mentioned about we don't have anything in the scriptures that is that doctrinally that supports having a one-on-one interview. No, it's nowhere in there. Or actually asking sexual questions. I'm going to disagree with you on that one, Bryce. We do have the gold standard of interviews. The gold standard right there in the Bible when Jesus Christ interviewed the woman that was caught in adultery. That's the gold standard, what Jesus Christ did. He simply said, go and sin no more. Not one single probing question from the God that we worship. That's the gold standard. So we do have that doctrinally in the scriptures.
And even
it ought to be doctrine.
I mean, even that was in an open public square, not even behind closed doors, because, who knows?
Yes, that's right.
No, I love that we could call it a data point to use to bolster the argument, but I appreciate your approach of saying we're going in support of the brethren to try and get them to change something, instead of saying we are opposed to something that is happening in the church, when that seems like the way that it's viewed from an outsider's perspective. But when you try and couch it in saying we're doing this in support of bringing the church into the 21st century, then that makes it seem not so combative. That makes it seem like there doesn't need to be a defense because we're not on the offense. We're just. But also, I can see that getting lost in the noise because it's a march on the church office building. I mean, it's a public picketing line that definitely garners some headlines, and I'm sure there's going to be a couple of news trucks there. And the church really hates, public stories coming out about the church. They like to stay way under the radar. So
yeah. So I am highly interested in as much publicity as we can get, not to embarrass the church. It may embarrass the church, I don't know, but to get the awareness out there. Even though there's been a lot of stuff going on, you had heard of our movement. Most members of the church haven't. Most members of the church don't know there's a possibility that their daughter is going to be asked, how many fingers did you use to masturbate? Most members have no idea that is even a question that's ever been asked in the church. Most members have no idea that their child could be so shamed they're thinking of suicide today. So we want to build as much awareness as possible that this movement is there and that parents can take action today, no matter what the policy is. Parents can make that decision to stand up and say, our family has made the decision to set certain boundaries. And our boundaries are no one-on-one interviews and you don't talk about sex. We're going to be there in every interview and we're not going to talk about sex. And let's make it an uplifting experience where the child feels closer to God and to Jesus and to the spiritual leader of their congregation, as opposed to walking out of there and never, ever wanting to set foot in that bishop's office again. So that's what we're already seeing that. If we stop today, Bryce, there's already been many wonderful things happen as a result of the petition, and that's one of them. There are now parents that are stepping up and setting boundaries for the child, the interviews with the children.
Number 374, name hidden. Trigger warning. This story includes abuse and strong language. My sister and I, at different times in our respective childhoods, mustered up the courage to tell the bishop about our dad, who physically, emotionally, and mentally abused us and our mother. I went in when I thought he might kill my mom after watching him choke her. I told my bishop about how he kicked, pulled hair, called us stupid bitches, and knocked me to the ground. My sister, in a different interview, told him about how our dad had pinned her to the bed and choked her, and that he threw plates at her that missed and broke into pieces against the wall. I was only 100 pounds, and my sister was much smaller. I once told my dad that he might kill us someday, to which he replied, "No, I won't let it get that far." But here's the problem. He was the ward clerk and a righteous and respected priesthood holder. I protested that he should not have a temple recommend, and that he was a horrible human being. My sister and I both got the same response: honor your father and mother. I thought, didn't you hear me? I had to threaten to call the cops to get him to let go of my mother's throat. The interview ended, and I decided that I was not right to tell anyone all along. They simply didn't care. By the time the next bishop was called, we had helped my mom kick him out with the help of police, and she had picture evidence of being punched. The judge at their divorce hearing told him to never hurt a woman and granted her a much-needed restraining order. After all this, the new bishop called my mother in for an interview, along with my little sister. I had moved out. They obediently went, and not long after sitting down, found that it was all a trick. the bishop had my dad come into the room so he could just talk to her about her breaking up the family. This bishop was clearly breaking the law, and he knew it. They blamed my mother for the divorce. My mom and sister got up and left, not knowing that they could not count on the bishop to protect them. How can battered women ever escape in a system like this? And why don't they matter? This was over a period where we had a total of 6 bishops. The 3 of us do not believe bishops have special discernment in the least. You know, I'll just share this briefly with you. I actually just spoke with my folks today, who are, faithful attending members, and we discussed your campaign. They said, "How's work going?" And I said, "Well, I have a very interesting interview coming up tonight. I'd like to get your thoughts on it." And the concerns that I have voiced with you have been the concerns that they talked about with me, and that is specifically that, well, having one-on-one bishops interviews does make it so that, a kid who may not open up about abuse when their parents are sitting next to them, they may open up to this bishop. But I also did talk to them about the training that bishops receive. And I know that you were a bishop, in spite of what you may have said earlier in this interview. I know that you did spend 5 years as a bishop, and I want to ask you, what kind of training is there for that? And I'll qualify this question because recently Mormon Leaks dropped a leak about this video that was a bishop's training video. And for a section of the video, it talked about sex abuse, and it issued the sex abuse hotline, the internal hotline that the church uses when anything like this does come up. And, this is like a 22-minute video. How many of these do you watch? How many training sessions do you go into when you're a bishop? Who do you talk to get wisdom from on high in order to understand how you're supposed to conduct your calling? Because it's one of the most complicated callings, and it's done by people who are already working 40, 50, 60 hours a week at their day job. What kind of training did you get?
Well, you get a ton of training. But the training that I had with regards to how to interview a child is this much. This one right here, 0, nothing, nada on how to interview a child. I talked to I have a friend who was my most recent, he was recently released from a bishop, as my bishop about 3 years ago. And I asked him, how much training did you get about for interviewing children? None. I don't know what training they give for interviewing children. Now, sex abuse. I remember one training session about interviewing, but it wasn't specifically directed to children. I guess it could be to some degree, but this one, the first one was with regards to sex abuse, no training about how you talk to people about it. It was, if someone comes and has a sex abuse deal, then here's the 800 number to call. And frankly, as a bishop, I'm thinking, I'm sure glad they gave me that number. I never had to use it, but that gave me a lot of comfort that I don't know what the hell to do when somebody comes in and asks me tells me about sexual abuse, but I've got a phone number. Yes.
So with that number, do you know who's on the other end of that number? Because that's baffling to me, because when I tried to call the PR office at the church about this, I got in touch with Eric Hawkins' office, and his secretary said, we've issued a public statement in response to the Protect LDS Children, and we have a public statement about where that hotline goes. And the hotline just says they are put in touch with trained counselors and a lawyer. And that's it. It doesn't tell us who the trained counselors are. It doesn't tell us what training they get. It doesn't tell us if they are somebody who has gone through the church's own training regiment that they have of videos and of classes. It doesn't say if they're a trained, psychologist or psychiatrist. It doesn't tell us any details. And I'm just trying to find out who these people are that handle those phone calls when they come in on that hotline, because they better be good. They better be really, really good. But as Josue said in the comments, it's opaque as a brick wall. There's no transparency here. And I think that's what people are most frustrated with, is the fact that the church won't be open and honest about how they deal with this.
So I have no idea where the 800 number goes. I didn't think to ask where it goes. They just said, call this 800 number. I said, yes, if it ever comes up. That's right there. I know who to call. Wow. Now, the other elements of the training that I received that relate to this. One was when somebody confesses, and I'm thinking adults because I didn't have kids come in and confess. I had one kid, not two kids, that came in and confessed some stuff in 5 years. But I had adults come in and confess. And so here's one of the they said, when somebody makes a confession, don't do this. And we're on video, right? He said, don't do this. Okay. Yeah, I felt like doing that sometimes, but I've never done that. I need to be careful about my facial expressions. So I thought that was an interesting comment. Now, here's the other piece of training that I got. So I had lots of training, but these three elements I remember well, and especially the one I'm going to tell you about. I even remember, since it was so impressed on me, I remember the name of the social services, LDS social services person that gave the training. I won't say her name right here, but I still remember that. So she said, I want you to, this is a training we're supposed to bring our Relief Society president. My Relief Society president was about 30 years older than me at the time. Had been good friends for a long time. I said, okay, I want you to put your chairs opposite each other and sit facing each other. Okay, we did that. Now, I want you to tell each other of your last sexual experience with your spouse. Well, I'm sitting there thinking, really? I got to tell my Relief Society president about the last time we made love, and she's going to tell me? Okay, so I led off, and I told her about my last sexual experience with my wife. That's rather embarrassing. Yeah. She then said to me, geez, I can't remember when the last time we made love. That was the end of her thing. Well, so that she said the purpose of this training is so that you know how uncomfortable it is for somebody to come in and talk about their sexual sexual sin. Well, I regret to this day, not as badly as I did over the years, that I followed that woman's instruction. Because afterwards, as I talked with some of the other, because this is a talking point. These are other bishops that I am friends with in the room. Right. You'd ask, oh, geez, how did you handle that? Oh, no way I'd share that. How did you handle that? Oh, I blew it off. Was I the only one in the whole room that talked about something so horrible as that? I'm guessing I was. Okay. So I felt bad about that for years. You kind of humiliated and mad at myself that I fell for that, for stating that when nobody else did. But what it's caused me to think, what about those poor kids that were asked all those detailed sexual questions and that scarred them for decades? Even if it only happened once, they're still carry humiliation that they answered those questions to the power figure in the room. So anyway, that's the extent of the training I got, Bryce.
But even the fact that you got that training shows that the idea of sexually explicit questioning is uncomfortable for adults to share with other adults.
Yes.
And it shows also that they are aware of how uncomfortable it is and have decided to create this seemingly meaningless exercise in order to make you empathize with these kids that you're asking these questions about. And it just shows, I think, one thing we've talked about is how pervasive this seems to be. How often is it that a bishop meets with somebody and asks them these explicit questions? And just having that very simple training exercise shows that it's very frequent that a bishop will leave these training exercises knowing that they need to ask those explicit questions, knowing that it's going to be uncomfortable for everybody in the room, but knowing that it's part of the policy and part of the MO of the bishop's interviews. I can't get over how weird it is that that is understood as part of the controlling mechanism, the mind control mechanism that is used in order to pigeonhole people into being ashamed of their sexuality. And that's one of the main points of this campaign, is that it damages people to talk about these things, especially at a young age, and it causes them to be ashamed and afraid of their sexuality, which has long-term ramifications that you can't exactly quantify on a 0 to 10 scale. That's just appalling to me, that they understand how uncomfortable it is for people, but yet it's still the practice, it's still the policy. And it sounds like it's the majority of bishops that practice this policy.
Well, now, I don't know that. I don't know what percentage it is. It's just significant, very significant.
Story number 299, name withheld. Trigger warning. The story includes sexual assault and suicide. I was a 14-year-old child. I was raped. Had just had a lesson on virtue the week before. I was so traumatized. I didn't tell my parents because of the whole, it would be better to have your child come home in a pine box than to lose their virtue rhetoric. I went to my bishop because I thought I had committed the sin second only unto murder. I was asked if I was morally clean. I said no. He asked what happened. I told him that a boy I was acquainted with had forced himself on me. He asked what I had done to provoke the boy. He asked what I was wearing. He asked me to describe exactly what my rapist did to me. He asked me how I felt while it was happening. He asked if I orgasmed during the assault. He asked if I had ever done this before. He asked if I liked it. Where did he, my rapist, put his hands? How many fingers did he put inside of me? Then he told me I had committed a serious sin and must repent for my part in it. I was forced to repeat this in front of the bishop, his counselors, and the clerk. Every time I was asked a question, it was like being raped again. 6 months disfellowshipped. That night I tried to kill myself, the first of many tries. Luckily, I never succeeded. I can directly pinpoint years of suicidal ideation to this incident. My bishop should have called the police. He should have comforted me and helped me to see that it was an assault. No consent. Instead, I was punished for my rape. I know I am not alone in this. I know there are other survivors of sexual assault who have experienced the same issues with Mormon bishops. I cannot articulate the deep devastation this has caused. So I want to ask, this may send us down a rabbit trail of information that you may want to send people to instead of sharing with yourself, but you've been collecting a number of these stories that people have been sharing. I want to ask how this has affected you as a human being, Sam, and how this has made you feel about your efforts towards the campaign. What have you taken away from all of these stories that you've been collecting?
You know, my wife once told me, in fact, she told me this first time she ever told me this was a few months ago. She said, Sam, you have a curse. You have the curse of empathy. And, you know, I think we all have natural tendencies or natural talents or natural inclinations. And so her observation was at seeing how this affects me, that the stories that somebody else is suffering doesn't roll off my back. It doesn't, it's not something that I look at and say, oh, it was terrible, and then go jump in the hot tub and go about my business. It's something that motivates me, seeing the challenge that So I think, one, it's kind of brought out something that's been in me for a long time, but I also think it's changed me. Changed me in this way. I think it's a good way. I had no idea that this type of suffering goes on. I mean, we talk about sex abuse. We've used those words. Those words really didn't mean anything to me until I read story after story after story. And I've read enough. There's been about 2,500 stories that have been shared with me. There are almost 400 that people have written in detail on the website.
Wow.
But so I've been in the church, served in the church in all kinds of capacities, but I never knew the suffering was invisible to me. It was there, and I had no idea. It was all around me. So today, I know it is there. I don't know what kids are suffering. I don't know what they're suffering. They don't even know what they're suffering. They know it's wrong, something's wrong, but they don't understand it yet. I guess it's made me a whole lot more aware of how, and it's not just in the church, it's in society, but it's my family that's in the church. It's my friends that are in the church. It's my grandchildren that are in the church. And here I can stand up to this in the place I'm at. So it's kind of opened my eyes and opened my mind to, and I've learned a whole bunch in how to deal and how to talk with and I have a lot of insensitivities, not just that I didn't realize that was a sensitivity I need to be concerned about or not think of it that way. So it's made me a lot more aware, a lot more understanding, and brought out the empathy that could be considered a curse sometimes.
Well, Josue in the comment section says it's not a curse. To be empathetic, I mean, I agree with Josue. It's not a curse. And he also added in, it sounds like reading these stories has made you more human. You should be happy about that. And I wholeheartedly agree with that sentiment, that the movement is nothing without people behind it. And having these stories collected in a single place where anybody on the internet can read them all, from the first one to the very last one, all 400 of these stories. I think that adds the human face, the human element to this campaign that's so crucial to make it a true grassroots movement. And without having those stories, without having all of these extra anecdotes to use as singular datum, it's really hard to see that this will gain any traction. But having those makes it an actual movement instead of just you, Sam Young, ex-bishop, standing in front of a church with a picket sign. I think that really adds a lot of gravity to this situation and really gives it a bit more staying power.
So, Bryce, I never planned one step ahead of the other until probably around December of last year. So it was just taking you do something and see how that works. Then you figure out what do you do next. So I had probably from March of last year until December 1st of last year, I had at least 1,000 stories have been shared with me on my blog, on God's Day blog. I'd probably shared 100 stories in one form or another. But those stories, it's just kind of hard to access them on the blog. You got to know where to look. And somebody to ask me, I said, well, here's 5 different ones you can look at. But they were snippets. It just wasn't really accessible. And people kept saying, is this really happening? I can't believe this is happening. Prove it to me, show me. So it wasn't until after Christmas that I finally got a website up and started having people write their stories. But that is a major, I'm going to call it a weapon to batter down this policy that continues to harm our children. So anyways, that's been up since the end of December.
I'm glad you said it's a weapon to batter down this policy. You're not using it as a weapon against the church. You are using it as a tool to stop a single aspect that is practiced that seems to be damaging. I think that's a proper way to approach this. I want to ask, are you aware of any campaigns that are similar to this that may have been raised, or anybody else that's ever done what you have done in the past? Is there ever been a Protect LDS Children 0.5 prior to this that you or anyone else has done?
There have been a few people that have come forward and said, hey, Sam, I was trying to do this 2 years ago. I was trying to do this 5 years ago. I was trying to do this 10 years ago. And you go look at their blogs, and sure enough, they'd written this great stuff, much better than my stuff, written good stuff. But It does. I think in order to do what we've done so far, it requires a number of circumstances to come into play. And for the folks that tried to do it 2 years or 5 years, I don't think all the circumstances were in play to make it happen. They might not have been in the right stage of life. Their family might not have been in a place where they could actually stand up. They might not have been in a place career-wise. They might have been risking a whole bunch. I'm risking a whole bunch. But I'm 65 years old, so I've had an opportunity to establish my career. I own my own business, so I'm not going to be, I don't live in Salt Lake City, and all my clients are members of the church. If I lived in Salt Lake City, this could have been a real challenge for me to do, because my livelihood has been affected by this, but it has not been destroyed or significantly impacted. If I was in Salt Lake, that could be a whole different issue. So I think there's a whole bunch of issues in play why previous good people's efforts, why it did not take off.
I want to shed a little bit of realism on the situation once again, and I want to get your thoughts about this, Sam. I don't know if you read the New York Times obituary for Thomas S. Monson. Are you familiar with that? Did you read that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Are you familiar with the response to it?
Yeah. 120,000 signatures.
Yeah. Last I checked, it was just cracking 210,000.
Oh, wow.
The New York Times writes a slightly scathing article about the late prophet of the church. 210,000 signatures. A campaign to stop children from being emotionally and sexually abused within the church. We're cracking a solid 15,000. But I just wonder what your take is on this, seeing this incredible disparity between something that seems so benign as opposed to something that is your movement that is so crucial to get passed through, something that really, really has a great impact on millions of people. Literally millions of people are impacted by these bishops' interviews every day. We can't even crack 10% of the 200,000 signatures on the Monson obituary rewrite. How do you feel about it? How does that strike you?
I'm not surprised by that one bit, for a couple of reasons. I know a lot more about the culture of our church than I did just a few years ago. But the culture of our church would indicate that very thing. For somebody to speak up and say, look, I want to protect my prophet's reputation, hey, that's going to be popular with everybody. But then we have the part of the culture of the church is you never speak out against anything inside the church. If it came from Salt Lake City, it came from God, we just accept it, and it has to be right, no matter how illogical it sounds.
Of course.
So we've got that culture. You never speak out against anything that comes from Salt Lake City. So on the one hand, you're supporting the church. Well, great. 200,000 people can get on board. You have to say that you disagree with something in the church. You are now risking finances. You're risking your livelihood, risking the relationship with your wife, risking the relationship with your parents, risking the relationship with your friends, and maybe even violating a temple covenant is the way some people would view it. So our culture doesn't support people speaking out. On the petition, there's about a third of the signatures that are hidden. There's a name and an email address, but people decided to hide it, to be anonymous. Well, why are they doing that? Because they are concerned how that's going to affect them in real life. That's our culture. So that it doesn't surprise me, this disparity in signatures. But Bryce, I look at it this way. When I set out and said I'm going for 10,000 signatures, by the way, there was a major march last July in Salt Lake City over some government thing, had to do with some kind of benefits. They got 5,000 signatures, and they got, I can't remember, several hundred to march up to the state capitol. They had 5,000 signatures. I decided I'm going for 10,000 signatures. People initially told me, Sam, you're not going to get 10,000 signatures. Nobody gets, and it's not going to matter anyway. The church doesn't pay any attention to petitions. By golly, we got 10,000 signatures. We actually have 16,000 signatures today. So, hey, they got their 200,000, but we got our 16,000 when nobody thought we'd be able to do it. And then does the petitions, do they do any good? You bet they do some good. We've got awareness out of this. We've got changes. There are 3 bishops, sitting bishops, that have signed that petition. They're all anonymous, but 3 sitting bishops. There are 9 bishops total, those 3 and 6 more that have told me, Sam, we're on board with this. I no longer do one-on-one interviews. Hey, that's big. 9 wards where those children are now being protected. Now, I know there's 13,000 wards, so we got a long ways to go. But that petition, one, we got 16,000. That's big. And we made changes already.
I'm glad that you're able to keep things in perspective. That's a really healthy thing to do when you're starting any kind of grassroots movement like this. Story number 46, Dave S. I've lived with decades of shame, guilt, and anxiety due to dozens of private worthiness meetings with LDS leaders when I was as young as 11 years old. The questions were always sexually based and completely inappropriate. As a father and now a grandfather, I cannot fathom how this perverted system still exists. There is no doubt that millions of children have and continue to be emotionally harmed by this cruel and bizarre practice. It needs to end. A week before we are actually recording this, I put up a question thread on the site to see if people had questions for you. One person did comment and said, I don't have any context behind this comment. I'm hoping you can contextualize it for us. He said, his stake president insists that Sam is an apostate and they have told him to stop being so vocal. Tell us a little bit about the church's opposition to this campaign. What's happened? Okay. Well, the church, you mentioned, you called Salt Lake City, the public affairs. They said, we've already responded to the petition. They did. They responded to the petition. I say, yes! Look what the petition accomplished right there. We got a response from the church, and they came out and were totally honest and said exactly, this is what our procedure is, a wonderful procedure. Well, the procedure is one-on-one interviews behind closed doors. The bishop can ask anything they want. So that response from the church, I really like. It just reiterated this is what they do. They were totally honest about it. I'm just going to hang on one second, Sam. I'm going to read that quote for quote off of the KUTV Salt Lake City, just so people know this for context. This is from Eric Hawkins, the church's spokesman. He said, quote, personal interviews are an important part of ministering to those in a congregation. They offer an opportunity for a leader to know an individual better and to help them live the gospel of Jesus Christ. Leaders are provided with instructions and leadership resources and are asked to review them regularly. Our belief is that interviews should be meaningful and sacred opportunities for an individual to counsel with priesthood leaders who represent the Savior in their ministry, end quote. Is that the response that you're talking about, or is there something else that I missed? That was actually, was that the first or second? There's part of it that's not in there. Okay. Because it says we do have interviews where the parents are we encourage the leaders to invite the parents to be in the hallway or enjoy the parents or other adult in the hallway, an adjoining room, or the foyer. So good. They admitted that the interviews are supposed to be private, and they said private interviews with parents someplace else. Okay, good. And then what can they ask? Well, it should be age appropriate, and they shouldn't have asked inappropriate questions according to the age or something like that. Well, good. But they're directed by the Spirit for the questions they ask. So there's basically no limits to the questions they ask. And then they editorialized with a bunch of fluff that you just read from Eric Hawkins, which is fine. We want them to be uplifting interviews, but they're not when you start talking about sex. And Stephen just asked, so there's no guidelines on when is age appropriate to talk about these questions? Zippity-doo-dah. No. So, I'm trying to remember if you answered this or not, but did your stake president name you as an apostate? Did that happen?
Okay, so a little over a month ago, my stake president, I've been trying to meet with him for many months to talk about these issues. And finally, finally he agreed to a meeting. And so it was a 3-hour long meeting. I laid out my concerns. I presented him with a book, Sacred Stories of Sacred Children, Childhoods Destroyed Behind Closed Doors. Anyway, there were about 300 stories at that time, and I printed all of them out, book form, and gave them to him. And we talked about all our concerns. He basically said, there's no need to make any changes. We're doing just fine. And then after that 2.5 hours, then he went to his agenda, which was to call me an apostate. So he called me an apostate, read the definition of apostate, which is if you openly oppose the church or its leaders, that is apostasy. And I said, I don't oppose the church. I think the church is good. I don't oppose the leaders. I oppose one policy that is dangerous and damaging. He said, no, Sam, you oppose the church and its leaders. I said, no, I don't. I oppose a policy. No, Sam, you're an apostate. I mean, we went back and forth. No, you are. Yes, you are. Yeah. Finally, it was, I'm leaving it alone. We're not going to come to an agreement. I'm an apostate. He then said that he is obligated to protect the good name of the church, because that the good name of the church is not protected when we harm children. We protect the good name of the church by doing good things. So but his was he needed to protect the good name of the church, and that he said that I needed to stop speaking openly about this. Well, at the time I had a press conference scheduled in a week. And I told him I'm still in Houston. I'm still going to do the press conference. I'm not going to stop speaking out against this. So we ended up that his view was that I was an apostate. He needed to protect the good name of the church, and I needed to stop speaking openly. Mine was, I'm not an apostate. We'll protect the good name of the church when we get rid of this policy, and I'm not going to stop speaking out against this. So that was the story in that interview. I've not heard anything back. I still cannot believe they would excommunicate me, but I have basically been warned at this point.
I think it might be worth wearing that label with pride, Sam. If you look at the etymology, no, I'm serious. If you look at the etymology of apostate, the earliest roots of it meant a runaway slave, basically. So a slave who has shaken the shackles of their servitude. Maybe that's something worth pondering and thinking about, that maybe apostate isn't the worst thing in the world to be, especially when we're talking about conformity to a regime that is practicing emotional abuse when it comes to children. Story number 169, Brian B. Trigger warning, the story includes suicide. I did lose a 14-year-old son to suicide in 2014. This petition is correct about the risk of suicide attached to these interviews. In my most painful moments, searching for what sparked my Samuel's end-of-life decision, the issues presented in this petition quickly rose high on the list to investigate. Not just one, but 2 bishops testified while speaking at his funeral just how conscientious Samuel was during his bishop's interviews with them. Also, comments in his chat logs before he died hint that he was affected by these interviews. After over 3 years of grueling and intense research and pondering to understand, I place these interviews and the feelings of shame they produce as a major reason for his end-of-life decision. My haunting regrets tell me he might still be alive if I had not required that he participate in these interviews. God knows how I wished I had a Sam Young to enlighten me before his death. Story number 233, Austin B. Trigger warning, this story includes sexual assault and suicide. I looked at pornography in high school. My dad got a confession out of me by lying to me, and saying that he would drive me to Mutual, but instead drove into a dark alley. He pinned me in a corner and forced me to confess. When I did confess to my bishop, he told me that I should avoid all women, including my mother and sister, because I was prone to be a rapist. In high school, I got into a very toxic relationship with a girl who ended up raping me. I told my bishop, and he said since I was a male, that I liked it, and I needed to repent. I was so depressed after this and wanted to kill myself. I tried to kill myself once, but my best friend found me and saved me. I'm now married, and my wife has slowly started to help me work through some of the deep damage my Mormon experience has caused. I want to ask a little bit, do you know any of the history of when these questions started happening? Has this always been standard practice, these sexually explicit questions in bishops' interviews? Is there any idea of when this started becoming and what it is today?
I don't know the history of it. People have told me it started back in the 60s or 70s, but that's all speculation for me. I do not know the history.
Okay, fair enough.
I have some references where people were trained to ask explicit questions, but they're not mainstream. They're not. You can't look and say, okay, this is published to the whole church as part of the policy manual. It's not. So I really don't know exactly where they come from.
Okay, fair enough. I want to ask some. This is something when you were on Sean McCraney's show just a couple weeks ago, when I first reached out to you to try and get you for this hangout, for which I'm very grateful to you for coming on and talking to us. I did ask a question that was a little bit hurried and kind of amorphous. I'd like to voice that question in a different way. I'm of the opinion that if we were to get women in these positions, as opposed to having just strictly men in these positions that are conducting these one-on-one interviews, that maybe there may be more empathy for sex abuse that's happening. Maybe there won't be as much shaming that happens. And that by and large, if we have women who are integrated and, making decisions in this chain of leadership, this chain of command, that maybe we might see this, how things are practiced today move a little bit more to progress towards your end goals. What would you think about having women in a position where they are conducting these interviews, not one-on-one? I mean, obviously that's not a part of this, but having women be part of this interviewing process as well, instead of just 40-year-old untrained dentists talking to kids about sex.
Well, I think that would be a wonderful idea. That is not what the petition is calling for. But I sure think when a child, when a little girl is in that bishop's office, it would be a really good idea to have a woman in there, not another man or a parent. Now, if you got a parent in there, you're good. But if for some reason the parent can't be in there, which there are a number of reasons why they're not, let's say, whatever, I think it'd be much better to have a woman in the room than another man.
Okay, I'm really glad to hear that. And obviously this issue becomes much more complicated when you have children who may be being abused by their parents. That if they have a parent in there with a bishop, they're not going to open up about that. So that obviously adds another confounding variable with which to contend.
And that's really easy to fix. The child wants to come in and talk to the bishop. Great. Who would you like to come with you? Would you like a parent? No. Then who would you like? How about Sister Jones, who's our young women's president? Stu.
Yeah, that's fair. One thing I actually, the conversation with my folks today that we talked about as a possible other measure or another way to try and possibly curtail this is having kids able to open up to their seminary teachers the way that they are basically forced to open up to their bishops in these one-on-one interviews. Because, you see your bishop every Sunday or every other Sunday. You may meet with them once or twice a year while you're a kid and a teenager, but your seminary teacher, you see them 2 to 5 times a week. You may develop a rapport with your seminary teacher that you don't necessarily develop with your bishop. And you would hope that there may be more stringent standards when it comes to seminary teachers, teaching congregations of children. But I don't know if that's necessarily the case. I don't know if that's public information or not. But what would you think about having seminary teachers have just as much, bishops' interviews authority, end quote, as the bishops themselves have, and maybe being another possible outlet for those children?
Well, here are the two criteria. Number one, no one-on-one meetings, whether it's the bishop or the seminary teacher. Number two, you don't talk about sex. So I guess I'm not sure what the seminary teacher would be meeting with them about, but if they're meeting, it should not be. Those are the two criteria that need to be met.
Fair. That's a great way to come back to the central points. That's the whole point of this campaign. I think it's fantastic.
Let me mention something else. When you're asking these sexual questions, when you bring a child in and you ask them, are you living the law of chastity? That's a forced confession. We shouldn't be asking that question. We shouldn't be asking about sex because we're untrained, but I'm looking at why are we forcing confessions of our kids? That is not scriptural to force the confessions of the kids or anybody. But anyway, that's a side. You're right. That's a side matter. No one-on-one, no sexual questions.
Story number 278, Carrie B. Trigger warning, this story includes sexual abuse. I grew up in an abusive home. I was raped for the first time when I was 7. I spent decades trying to convince my leaders that it wasn't my fault. They insisted that I must have done something and I needed to repent. After all, what's the point of a worthiness interview if you don't get to spread some shame? All the shaming just made me more vulnerable to the abuse. They could have helped me. They could have helped my abuser. Instead, they dealt lasting damage to my sense of self and my sense of worth. I couldn't get away from the abuse and the abuser until after my kids had also been damaged. We are now dealing with the 4th major mental health crisis to hit our family of 6. My daughter is in the hospital and has been for 3 months with no end in sight. It didn't have to be this way. Good points to fall back on. The points of the petition, I wholeheartedly give my stamp of approval, and I'm actually invigorated to see that this is an issue that ex-Mormon communities have been talking about for years. This is an issue that, a few campaigns, as you said, Sam, have come up in the past in trying to push some level of reform. This is something that you were just on a Firebrand Christians TV show talking to him, and you as a believing active member of the church talking to this Firebrand Christian who is trying to save all of the deluded Mormons from their Satanism. All of us are working together. All of us are rallying behind this campaign. And the simple fact that there's that much unity about this single issue, I think that's really heartening to see this. I think it's inspiring to see how it's being received by these communities that are diametrically opposed on so many issues. But when it comes to protecting LDS children, hey, we have something in common. That's something we can all work towards.
Yeah.
So,
how cool is that? We ought to be able to join arms, regardless of what our beliefs are, and say, look, we want to protect all the kids, whether your kids or my kids or my brother and sister's kids who are still in the church. We ought to be protecting. It shouldn't matter whose kids they are. We want to protect the kids.
Bingo. So I will open up. If there are people on the panel here that have any questions, you're more than welcome to throw something in the chat or to unmute your mic and voice anything that you'd like. I'll give you a few minutes to kind of think about stuff.
Yes, I've got a few questions. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
I can. Yes.
Okay. So you mentioned. Let's see. First, I wanted to say thank you for what you're doing.
Oh, thanks.
And remember that you need to take care of yourself as well. Self-care is very important for activists because you're going to put yourself through a lot of stress dealing with this, and you can't help others if you're not taking care of yourself. So make sure you're doing that. And when I was in the church, I don't remember all the details of this story, but there was a story and testimony meeting. Or no, it wasn't testimony meeting. The bishop told one of the stories about before people of color were allowed to have the priesthood, there was a man who he was a person of color, and he prayed about whether he should stay in the church, etc. And the takeaway basically that's important here was the fact that even if the people in the church are wrong, that doesn't mean that the church itself is wrong. And I think that's where you're coming from on this. And we can disagree on how we feel about the church in general, but the fact that you think this policy is wrong doesn't mean you're attacking the church. So you mentioned that you didn't want your daughter to have shame about the idea of sex and sexuality. Could you go into a little bit of detail on that? Because that, to me, seems a little different than what the church teaches.
Okay. So when you read the stories, it's over and over. Shame is the central issue. That the child comes in, the bishop asks if they masturbate. Almost all the boys masturbate. Now, I don't know about the girls. But probably half the stories are women there. So apparently masturbation is common for the girls too. I'm not that familiar with it. Oh, somebody says girls knew. Now, how do you know that, Josue?
Because I'm a bio major.
Okay.
Also, I've studied people, and it's fun. Girls do also masturbate. So, yeah.
Yeah, I know they do, just because I've read all the stories. But growing up as a kid, I never thought about the girls masturbating. I thought I was the only one that was. I thought I was the only one that couldn't quit. It turns out everybody's in that shape. I just didn't have a bishop asking me about it. But once you have the shame, at 12 years old, 8 years old, 15 years old, your sexuality, we're immature. We don't understand. We're still growing and attaching things to our sexuality.
Sure. Yes.
If you attach shame by having to go talk to that bishop week after week, year after year, and you never can quit masturbating, you know you're sinning in front of God. You're disappointing the bishop. You're disappointing God. You've got this authority figure over you. He may even shame you in public by saying, well, you can't pass the sacrament. You can't go to the temple. Well, now you've put it out in the open. You've been shamed. You have to start making excuses why you can't pass the sacrament or why you can't go to the temple. So I don't know what the church is teaching. I was never taught that shame is an important principle of the gospel. I don't know where that is, if it's there, but it shouldn't be there. And especially when children go through this and they get that attached to sexuality, well, that's going to ruin their sex experiences when they become throughout their life, and not throughout their life. Hopefully they're going to get over that. But there's story after story of this affected my marital relations, both men and women having their marital relations affected because sex is now dirty. Even though you're told it's not, it's good. Well, it's been dirty for the whole time you were developing. Your mind was developing. And I'm not a psychologist, but I read enough stories to know basically how it works.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the church feels that shame should or should not be attached to sex? Or do you feel that your beliefs are in line with the church on that?
I think the church would not think, I don't really know exactly what the church thinks, but I can't imagine anybody standing up and say, okay, you're married now, sex is still shameful. No, I think they want to say that's a beautiful part of life. Unfortunately, it's a beautiful part of life that we've been taught is dirty. that the shame is attached. And so when they're telling us, yes, it is good when you're married, enjoy it, it's tough for many people. I'm just glad I didn't go through it. I feel sorry for the people that did, and we're working our butts off so this won't happen to kids in the future.
And then you mentioned the good name of the church and them calling you out for apostasy, possibly. That is a rough thing that you're going to have to come to terms with. It seems that you have come to face the idea that they may decide to excommunicate you. So I'm glad that you're being realistic about that. But I do remember when I was in the church, one of the things that kept coming back to me as I left the church was that it always seemed the appearance of doing good was more important than actually doing good. And
that's a problem.
So I think that's part of where this pushback is coming from is don't make a big fuss in the media about this because it'll hurt our image is more important than what you're actually attacking. Look at the pushback they got with the LGBT, all the people leaving over if your parents are gay, you can't hold the priesthood till 18, etc. That was a big to do, and that, like, you're asking for less than that, but you're still making their names in the papers, so they're not going to like that possibly. And then, Bryce, have you mentioned to Sam at all about Marie's issue about the windows on doors in churches?
I haven't. You're more than welcome to talk to him about it.
So Marie is a co-host with Bryce, who was not a Mormon, but she's getting familiar with the Mormon church. And she was appalled to see that the churches don't have windows on most of the doors to the classrooms and such. Do you think that's a change that should be done, where they have windows so that you can't have people keeping people in rooms, possibly against their will, etc., just as a safety issue in the church?
Well, I absolutely think there should be windows on all the doors, except maybe the bishop's office. So I know in our building, there are windows on every door except the bishop's office. I think that's the standard design today, and I think they're retrofitting. So that is kind of the standard. Now, there's been a lot of suggestion about putting windows on the bishop's door. And some places they do have windows. Some places they have a peephole. I'm not sure what the peephole does, but I do think that can cause some problems. If you've got a couple that is there talking with the bishop and they're struggling in their marriage and they start fighting or they start crying, or you got that 16-year-old girl that is just in the bishop's office. What are people thinking? So I'm not sure that I'm behind the window idea. What I'm behind is having two people in that room, having a parent in that room. Then it doesn't matter if there's a window or not. You got that parent to protect the kid.
And I'm not talking about the bishop's door necessarily. It was the other rooms.
Yeah, all the rest of them, they should. And I think the church has rapidly moved to make that change.
All right. Thank you. That's all I had.
Well, thanks.
If anyone else has questions, you're more than welcome to voice them at any time. Josue?
Honestly, I just got to say thank you for actually starting this organization, bringing it to light, and being there for these children. That's pretty much what I got to say. Thanks.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Thank you. And thank you, Josue, for confirming that girls do masturbate.
You're welcome.
You'll find a lot of sympathy from this crowd. I think a lot of the people who are here, who are listening to this, who will listen to this in the future, are cut from the same cloth and have experienced this, whether it's through Mormonism or through other versions of Christianity. This these sexual shaming practices that seem to be replete throughout Christianity. Shame is a powerful controlling mechanism, and when you're able to attach shame to some of our most deepest human emotions and desires, you have a fair amount of latitude in controlling a person's just their mind. You control their mind. So, Sam, I personally as well want to thank you for this so much. I look forward to seeing you March 30th downtown Salt Lake City. I'm looking forward to seeing what kind of a turnout will happen. I'm very optimistic about how this will go. And even more so, I look forward to how the public sphere is going to deal with this march after it happens, what the headlines are going to look like afterwards, because I think that's where the real work is done, is not when the actual march happens, but in the days after the petition.
Yeah.
After the march.
So let me just mention reinforce the march. So I don't know how many people are going to hear this, but we're having a march in Salt Lake City, March 30th. That's Good Friday, the day before General Conference starts, 12 o'clock noon. And I want to invite everybody that's here, if you're within driving distance, please come to the march. This is going to be a historic event where things are going to happen. Now, I know Kate Kelly had a march. I'm not that familiar with it, but we're marching 5 blocks, 1,000 people, to deliver something highly important, the petition, and then these stories of the damages that we've done to motivate the changes to be made. This is going to be a historic thing. Come be a part of that historic. Come stand up for our children with all of us. Now, if you're not within driving distance and want to participate in a march, we are having local rallies in various places around the country where people are going to gather the very same time at noon o'clock on March 30th. And we're doing that. A lot of people want to participate, but they can't get to Salt Lake City for one reason or another. But the other thing is, we want to demonstrate to the world, to the country, to the media, that this is a national thing. This is not just a Salt Lake City thing. This is happening all across the country. So if you're interested in participating in a local rally or the Salt Lake City March, please go to the website and register for one of those too. So we have an idea of how many people are going to come, but the local rallies, we need to know who's interested so we can organize those. The website is protectldschildren.org, and all the information, you just click on stuff and you'll find it. And that's all I wanted to say.
Well, I think that's a wonderful note to leave everybody off with. Sam, this has been a fantastic interview. As I said, I look forward to meeting you there in person. If I can make the trip down from Seattle, you guys can make the 45-minute drive from wherever you are to Salt Lake City. And I hope to see everybody there. Sam, I look forward to shaking your hand and thanking you in person for what you're doing and for all the sleepless nights that this has caused, for all of the frustration, for all of the emotional turmoil of reading through these stories, for all of the backlash that will inevitably come from this, for all of the frustration you and your family have gone through and will be going through for this. I say we are with you, and we all thank you for being the tip of the spear that is, making this charge happen against the church and for the church, not against, but for the church.
That's right. It's for the church. If you don't like the church, you're going to be working against what you don't like because this is helping the church, helping the children, and the side effect is going to help the church.
Fantastic. It's a great way to look at it, and it's a great way to make it so Mormons who are sympathetic to the cause do not become defensive against the cause. And I think it's, all in all, I can't wait to see how this plays out, not only in this coming month, but also in the years to come, to see how this has had an impact on the church, and what point we can look at on this and see how the church takes this criticism with grace, as they usually do. So thank you, Sam. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We've gone a bit long. I appreciate you giving us so much time tonight. This has really been a pleasure. And I'll see you at the end of this month.
Perfect. Thanks. Appreciate everybody being here.
Take care, everybody. Hope you have a good night. And now for the last of these stories. This is the most explicit of all the trigger warnings. This story includes abuse, sexual assault, slut-shaming, sexually explicit questioning, and many other subjects which many listeners may find disturbing. If you haven't skipped any of them, you may want to on this one. But it really drives the point home. Story number 339. Name hidden. I wish I was brave enough to post my name, but my family is still unaware of my faith transition. I feel like a coward. My heart is beating rapidly and nervousness as I type this out, but I need to do it. I grew up in an extremely dysfunctional family. My dad was a highly abusive narcissist, and my mom just sat back and let it happen. I was essentially a co-parent with my mom. I developed severe bulimia that I nearly died from, along with severe OCD, depression, and anxiety that would follow me for years. It still does, as a direct correlation to my home and church life growing up. I guess I would have called myself highly sexual from the time I hit puberty. I now know I was probably just a normal, curious teenager. My first kiss was horrible. I had a boy 2 years older than me take me to his room when I was 13, pin my hands above my head, pull my shirt up, grope my breasts, and begin yanking my pants down. Thankfully, my friend walked in, and it was stopped. I'm absolutely unable to explain the extreme guilt I felt. I was defiled. I didn't really even understand at the time that I was taken advantage of, because the person I told of the encounter, the bishop, just punished me. I was told not to take the sacrament for several weeks, and no temple recommend for me. I had to describe in detail what had happened. I was so ashamed, and my anxiety was through the roof. This boy told everyone I had sex with him. I lost every single one of my friends in 7th grade. I remember he contacted me on Messenger and said, "You suck. You're such a dumb slut. You told everyone we had sex." I was so confused and had nowhere to turn. Well, somehow this experience didn't deter my sexual feelings. I wanted to feel desired by boys. I was so much taller and had developed much sooner than other girls, and I was just sort of weird. Since people were calling me a slut anyway, I figured what I did didn't matter. I was extremely bullied all through junior high and high school, to the extent of having many emails sent to me urging me to commit suicide because I was better off dead, slut. I think I was pretty, though I didn't know. I was thin, but thought I was fat. My life at home was out of control and school was hell. Enter bulimia as a way to gain control. I went to nearly every bishop I had, pleading for help at home. I had a lot of bishops because my parents couldn't ever afford housing, so we moved a lot. My dad was so mean and so abusive. "Please help me," I begged. I got the same answers always. "Honor my father's priesthood. I'm being dramatic. It can't be that bad because my mom stays." Anyway, I had large breasts from the time I was 12. I was absolutely unaware of the effect my body had on older men at the time. I didn't know I was dressing sexy. I wasn't trying to be sexy. I was just trying to find something to wear while constantly growing and never having money to buy new clothes. During my 12 to 17 year period, I had 2 bishops. They both called me into their office monthly, not exaggerating, commenting on how my outfits were turning men on and I was walking pornography. Well, I just thought that was disgusting and not my problem. Additionally, my mom was always harping on me for dressing immodestly. I responded the only way that made sense. Rebellion. Fine, if men were getting turned on, gross, not my problem, and I will continue to dress how I want. In the meantime, I was hooking up, Mormon version making out, hand stuff for the most part, with any boy who would have me. I was disgusting and ugly in my eyes, and if boys were turned on by me, though I couldn't understand why, I would take advantage and hook up with them, if only to feel wanted for a moment. I was in and out of the bishop's office constantly. These 2 men questioned me incessantly every time I went in with a new confession. I would be nauseous with anxiety every time I had to see the bishop. I asked myself, what was wrong with me that I couldn't control myself? Why didn't I love God enough to stop committing these sexual sins? These men would ask questions like, were your nipples erect? Did you orgasm? How deep did his fingers go? Did you enjoy yourself? How long did your climax last? Did your vagina get wet? I've since found out both these bishops asked several of my same friends in the ward the same questions. But these were well-respected and loved men. They were not wrong in my eyes. I was. I was told over and over that every time I committed another sexual sin, all the other sins were brought back on me. I'm unable to explain the gravity of this comment. I was driven insane, thinking of how immoral I was. My OCD and anxiety skyrocketed. I wanted to go to the Lord's house. I wanted to be good. But how could I do that when boys really only desired me when I used my body? I wanted so desperately to be wanted. Well, my boyfriend, now husband, and I ended up doing something really bad about 3 weeks into dating. This was my first time at anything like this. I knew I had crossed a big line this time. I was sick. We nearly broke up. I had just gotten my recommend back from a previous repentance process. So once again, I made an appointment with the bishop, absolutely agonizing the days before my appointment over my grievous sin. The bishop told me my boyfriend had to be addicted to porn. Where else would he get ideas like this? He said this is not husband material and recommended I end the relationship. This type of man that desired such sick, sexual things would surely grow up to be an abusive spouse and father. I remember this next part so well. This huge 400-pound man leaned his head back, closed his eyes, and told me to describe in detail what had happened, asking probing questions along the way. I felt sick. But what could I do? This was God's representative. He knows what is necessary for me to be forgiven. My husband is the best man and anything but abusive. I'm thankful I didn't take the advice of my bishop. Fast forward to when I am 21, and my husband is on his mission. I was at a party, and someone spiked my drink. My friends described hearing crying and screaming from the upstairs room I was in. I deduced from this, and from the fluids on my dress, that I had been raped. I was devastated because how would my returned missionary husband ever want me again? This time with a new bishop, I once again went in to repent. It honestly did not even occur to me that I didn't need to repent because it had not been my fault. Once again, I was told that this may not have happened if I was being faithful to my missionary and dressed modestly. My heart was broken. I can't blame the church for my OCD and other issues. However, I can and will say they were absolutely exacerbated by the policies of the church. I now know that in no way is your worth attached to your sexuality. It just does not work this way. The teachings within the church regarding sexuality are harmful to every man and woman or child of any age. I am not out to either side of my family about where I stand with the church. The idea of what will happen when I tell them I no longer believe sparks too much anxiety. Thankfully, my husband wants to stay with me, even though he believes. These practices are harmful, and they do no good. The simple answer is no more interviews. I wish the church would drop their obsession with sexuality, but I know that won't happen. So let's at least protect our members, our children, and stop these interviews. A child does not need to think that they are any less of a person because they have sexual desires. Yes, it may be rare that you have an actual story of physical abuse behind the door, but I am here to tell you that abuse doesn't have to be physical. It can be mental. I believe what I suffered at the hands of bishops is abuse, and any of my non-Mormon therapists will attest to that. The LDS Church should not be allowed to perpetuate this myth that they think family is the most important thing. They don't think that. If they did, these interviews would have already stopped rather than receiving pushback from the church, and I'm sure this will result in the excommunication of Sam Young. What a travesty. If the church believed in families, they wouldn't care if gays marry or if one race marries another. They would be happy more love is being created in the world. If they cared about families, they would make women feel equal to men, instead of having women give themselves to husbands in the temple. Please, LDS Business Corporation, stop these interviews and do the right thing for once. If you're hearing this, I want to thank you for sticking it out. This has been an excruciating episode in many ways. But this needed to happen. And before we got into the actual discussion with Sam, I said that these stories matter. We need to understand that we're making history. Let me put that into context. A lot of history is taken from first-hand accounts in addition to verifiable documentation. First-person experiences put history into context for us, a crucial piece to constructing historical models. If we look back at the beginning of the church, the extent of uprisings in early Mormonism will truly never be known because of how little documentation we have of the period. Court hearings in the early church involved a single entry in the history of the church as something like held counsel for elder fill in the blank who was led into error. And that's it, because the history of the church has been written by the victor. The number of first-person experiences this campaign has collected is how history is truly created. Those of us who study history can often become disconnected with the story of the people who experienced the history in our never-ending pursuit of seeing big-picture concepts. But one thing we can't lose sight of is the need to give these accounts the weight they deserve. They may not carry as much weight as depositions, legal affidavits, but all of these allegations of physical, mental, and emotional abuse caused due to bishops' interviews, and all of them provide data and put the modern history of the church into context by adding that crucial human element. Legal cases are built upon allegations, and the more of these data points we collect, the stronger the case becomes that the church currently uses bishops' interviews to inflict pain, suffering, social and emotional abuse on its members who are simply trying to be the most righteous and stalwart Mormons they're capable of being. Let's take a step back and just appreciate something for a second. Look what the internet has done to the church. With such rapid access to information and the ability to tap into hundreds of stories from all across the globe in a matter of seconds, any idea how hard it was to collect or consume that amount of information even 20 years ago, let alone 180 years ago when the church was in its infancy? This campaign to protect LDS children and the stories it's generating are vital to historians of the future. When historians in 100 years look back on the early 21st century, they'll see how much these campaigns, which arose solely out of the internet community, have had on our society. We're in the middle of writing history. And the fact of the matter is, every tweet, every email, every court case which hits the headlines, every single one of these interactions write history in some way. We're lucky to live at a time when a conflict arising in Mormonism isn't swept under the historical rug. Instead, we can see the people this impacts and hear their stories firsthand. We can appreciate and put into context the pain and suffering and all of the psychological damage these interviews cause by witnessing all of this information aggregate with a grassroots movement, just like Protect LDS Children, Mormon Stories, and Ordained Women. And that's why these stories matter. No longer is Mormon history what the church wants it to be. Instead, it's the members and the outside world who are actively constructing the historical models that our modern time will be viewed through by future historians. We have a duty to protect members of the church, children, adults, practicing members, cafeteria or Jack Mormons, and ex-Mormons alike all need to understand what has happened to us and deal with the psychological turmoil caused by these policies and nip them in the bud. And no single person or body of people are at fault here. I know we want to pin the blame for abuse on somebody, and us ex-Mormons will be quick to point the finger at the Quorum of the 15, but the problem is that those 15 men are victims of the same self-perpetuating cycle which has hurt millions of people so far. They're no more at fault than their forefathers for conforming to this damaging system. The hardest part about dealing with sex as a controlling mechanism is that throwing blame may make us feel better, but it doesn't get us anywhere. Arguably, blaming somebody or a group of somebodies is counterproductive to moving forward and healing the wounds of old. If the church is smart, They'll take this movement with grace, and on Saturday morning, they'll take the stand at General Conference and issue a public statement addressing the concerns of Sam Young's campaign. They can turn this petition into a positive. They can stand at the pulpit and tell the 26,000 Mormons in that cathedral and the millions of Mormons watching worldwide that they're intent on listening to the concerns of their members. The issue of sexually explicit bishops' interviews has recently come to their attention, and they've decided to respond to these concerns by agreeing to the 2 criteria of the campaign. Bishops' interviews from now on will be conducted with more than one adult in the room, and questions about chastity and sexuality will be removed from this time forward. The church is bleeding members right now. And I think it could largely be due to how little say that Mormons feel like they have in their own church. The leadership is disconnected and insulated from the will of the people. What better way to restore faith and goodwill in the fragile relationship the leader has with its members than by making a systematic change based on a public petition with more than 15,000 signatures? That's how you show the members that you're actually listening to them. But unfortunately for us all, that seems like a pipe dream. I don't know how this will play out in the coming months. None of us do. But if history is any indicator of future events, the battle has only just begun. That's going to do it for today. Thank you so much for sticking around for this episode. Quick couple of points of house cleaning. We had a couple of new patrons that pledged to support the show over at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. Looks like we had a pledge edit by Stink Vomit, a pledge by Zach, and a new pledge by Anonymous. So thank you to all of you for your pledge edits and for your new pledges. That is awfully kind of you to support the journalism and research that goes into producing this show every week. We hope you enjoy all of the extra content that Patreon subscribers get over on the Patreon feed. Thank you so much to Julianne for running the Twitter and Facebook pages and keeping the conversation going over on that side. Be sure to give her a follow at The Real Emma Hale on Twitter. Thank you to Jason Camo for providing the music used in the show with his permission. Go to aloststateofmind.com to hear his music there. Thank you to Natalie Newell for being the production assistant, keeping the interviews rolling on the back end. Thank you to Andrew Torres of the Opening Arguments podcast and the law offices of P. Andrew Torres for providing legal counsel for this show. And thank you, most of all, for sticking around, even when times are a little bit tough and we have some serious issues to deal with. Thank you so much for listening. I hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism podcast. preceding podcast is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2018, all rights reserved.